Good evening. The UK is to have a referendum by the end of 2017 on whether to remain a member of the European Union or to leave. Prime Minister David Cameron wants to renegotiate the terms of the membership, and it's thought he will campaign for Britain to remain in the EU if he gets the reforms he wants. Well, joining me to discuss the planned in-out referendum is the head of Labour's pro-EU campaign, West Hull and Hessle MP Alan Johnson, and Martin Vickers, who is the Conservative MP for Cleethorpes and a Eurosceptic. I'm going to start off then by summing up what Mr Cameron is calling for then. So we have several points: restricting benefits for EU migrants for 4 years, not allowing the UK to be drawn into further political integration, giving greater powers to national parliaments to block EU legislation, and securing explicit recognition that the euro is not the only currency in the European Union. Martin, I'm going to come to you first then. Is this the right time to address these issues? Why now?
Well, I think it's an issue that's been essential that we approach. I've been one of those who's been pushing for a referendum for many years. I think irrespective of whether you're for or against membership, in order to settle this for the next generation, we do need a referendum. And I think the 4 points that you've highlighted there that the Prime Minister is negotiating around are things that most of the British people would support, and if he can get a better deal, even better. So I think it's the right approach at the right time.
And Alan, do you agree with what David Cameron is calling for?
I think it's a bit of a sideshow in the sense that the referendum won't be about the package. It'll be, do you want to remain in or do you want to come out? The second point I'd make is reform is a process, it's not an event. So doing this as a kind of, high noon with your hand on the exit door, it doesn't always work. I was a trade union negotiator for many years. You have to be very careful when you make those kind of, make that approach to negotiation. There's lots of our EU partners, other countries, who want to see changes, at least in some of those areas. And I don't know whether that's the best way to do it. Having said that, one crucial issue is the position of non-Eurozone countries like us. There's 9 at the moment out of 28 member states, but there's likely to be fewer. And I think establishing our position as a non-Eurozone country, but with no downside to that is very important. So I do think that needs to be done sooner rather than later. Whether it's best to do it in this way, as I say, I think it is a bit of a sideshow.
But do you agree fundamentally with what he's asking for?
I agree with what he's asking for there, yeah, definitely. On the other points, ever closer union. It's a Tory government that changed the words on that. It said ever closer union of the peoples, not the states of Europe. And they added on, consistent with the principle of subsidiarity. That was a very important principle, which the major government, not my government, established back in the 90s. And subsidiarity means that Europe only deals with those issues where aggregating your power, your authority, your resources makes a difference. If it doesn't, then it should be, then the principle of subsidiarity should apply. So I think that's a bit of a sideshow. On the issue of benefits, I think that's, we were looking for 2 years in our last manifesto. 4 years is, as they say in the civil service, interesting, Minister. I don't think he's going to get it, but that was a Conservative Party manifesto.
It's a negotiating position, isn't it?
Yes.
As you say, in the same way as labour relations, there will be a compromise in the end. And I think the British people actually will probably say, well, OK, you went for 4 years and we've ended up with 2 or 3. We've improved the situation.
And for the referendum to take place, these changes will have to happen prior, won't they? Do you think that's probable?
Well, if we're going to have a referendum this year, which seems to be the most likely outcome, I think there will be an element of having to take things on trust. But once you've gone to the country, and if the government got the backing to stay in, for example, then they will have to deliver. There's no getting away from that. So it is a difficult situation to manage from the Prime Minister's point of view, but I'm confident that irrespective of the outcome, we'll see it through.
And a report published by the European Scrutiny Committee warns voters that to achieve binding and irreversible reform of Britain's deal with the EU, treaty change will be needed, which cannot be achieved before the referendum. Alan, will treaty change be required?
Depends on what the outcome of the negotiations are. One thing's for certain, the second part of that is true. won't happen before before the referendum. The referendum's likely to be in June. But listen, I want Britain to vote to remain in. So in a sense, I want the Prime Minister to succeed. And if what he comes back with makes people more inclined to vote to remain, great, that's fine by me.
And looking ahead then, when we look at the national effects of being part of the European Union, you know, the first point I made about EU migrants not getting in-work benefits for 4 years, what do you think of that?
Well, I'd like to see the Prime Minister achieve that. As I say, it may well be that we only end up with 2 years or whatever, but the situation will be improved. It's something that people feel very strongly about, and it's partly as a result of our circumstances. Our system is different to the contributory systems in many of our neighbouring countries. And I think it's basically a system of fairness. The British people, on the whole, are not opposed to people who come here, work and are taxed and so on, as long as they pay their dues and then subsequently receive benefit. But to come here and in effect on day one be eligible when they've perhaps been contributing for 20, 30 years, there is an obvious unfairness.
But they are part of the European Union, aren't they? They are free to travel where they want to travel within that union and to get a job.
Indeed they are, but most people don't, of course. Most people in Ireland, as my constituencies, will continue to work, if not locally, certainly within this country. And although, yes, there has to be some give and take, I think when it comes down to it, as I say, it's a basic question of fairness.
And David Cameron has been talking to other European leaders, hasn't he, about this? The Hungarian Prime Minister said that he didn't agree with the fact that the benefits could be stopped, that people could be seen as parasites, Europeans, that he doesn't like the word migrants.
I find it very offensive, and there's no... Britain has more of its citizens living and working in other developed countries than any other country in Europe, more than Poland. So you can understand people getting upset. And of course there is no evidence that people come here to claim benefits. The head of the Office of Budget Responsibility said there is absolutely no evidence that that is the case. But it is an issue. The reason why we felt it wasn't as part of some referendum campaign, we just felt that 3 months, which is the existing rules for habitual residency, was too low. There is a question, Martin touched upon it, and I think it's interesting as to whether we should have a more contributory system. That was the original principle that was set up by the Attlee government, and it kind of has fallen into disarray. If we had a contributory principle, as many other European countries do, that said you have to have worked or been a resident of the country for so many years before you could claim benefits, there would be no argument here, because then that wouldn't be discriminatory. It would apply to our own citizens as well. And I don't know, I think maybe this may spark off a wider debate about whether we change to a contributory system, because I think there's a lot of merits in that.
And a sense of feeling when you talk to people, a lot of people think that people are coming here, getting benefits, getting money, and that seems to be a massive factor in people wanting to leave the EU. So how do you go about tackling those conceptions?
You're right, it is a conception that somehow we can make Britain a kind of fortress Britain, that people will no longer want to come here. I mean, the first point is free movement is part of the EU. You're not going to escape free movement without coming outside of the European Union. I concede that argument. My argument would be that if you leave the European Union, you lose all that benefit, the biggest commercial market in the world, bigger than China, bigger than America. You lose all of that, you're still going to get free movement, because all the members of all the European countries in the free trade area who are not members of the European Union all adopt every single dot and comma of European Union legislation, including Norway, including Switzerland. There is no model of us being outside the EU but still having access to that huge market without us accepting free movement. We're not going to be able to say to countries, oh, give us a fair deal on trade. Yes, we've just stopped your people coming into this country.
And as you said before, you know, there's like 1.4 million British people that travel abroad. How could it affect expats that want to live and work if we weren't in the European Union, Martin?
Well, there is obviously a risk that if you take action against one group of people, there could be some sort of retaliatory action against expats, and that's something which I'm sure figures within the negotiations. I mean, Alan's right. The logic of Alan's position is quite simply that the only way to end the free movement, of course, is in effect to leave the Union. On balance, my position is and always has been, I voted to leave in 1975, has always been on that side of the argument. But it's a closely balanced argument. I would acknowledge that I'm not one of these people, as some of my colleagues are, who I imagine sort of wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night thinking, isn't it awful we're in the EU? And my mind is just a
Martin's
logic.
not swivel-eyed. The other way.
Exactly. It's a balanced argument.
On that point, Martin, I'll just have to leave it there. Welcome back. Now, some of Britain's biggest trading partners are in the EU. We look at France, we look at Germany, and more than 50% of our exports go to EU countries. If we were to pull out of the EU, does it not seem a bit silly that we're going to take ourselves away from being around the table, so to speak, when things that are going to be discussed may affect us?
Well, I accept there is a logic to the argument that the restrictions and regulations and so on are going to be placed on British exporters. But Britain's place in the world has always been just that, a world trading partner, and I would like to see us expand our interests far more to the expanding areas of the world, in India. China may be having a little dip at the moment, but it's still a massive market, and the South American countries, Brazil and so on. And I tend to think that we look a little bit too inward in the sense of the EU itself, and certainly in terms of imports from the EU. We're still going to have a healthy trading relationship with our main partners in the EU. We have a trade deficit with many of them. The argument that they're suddenly going to stop trading with us is a nonsense.
But there are concerns over that, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to businesses in the constituency who do have genuine concerns, but I tend to think that on the whole they're ones that can be overcome. I've also spoken to businessmen who see the EU as just an annoyance, really. They're just a regulatory regime. Businesses don't like being regulated. They complain about, I don't know, the Environment Agency, Natural England, Government Council, whoever it happens to be. And the EU is just another one. There has to be, of course, a common regulatory regime. I think on the whole, the balance is in favour of leaving, as I've argued on the whole range of issues. But, I accept the fact that we will still have to abide by the rules if we want to trade with them, but equally we have to abide by American rules to trade with the States, or Australian rules to trade with them, or whatever. Businesses can adapt.
But Alan, is that part of your campaign, that we need to be around that table?
No, this is crucial. But this is crucial because, yes, we do abide by the rules. We do need to abide by the rules, and the rules will say free movement. So anyone who thinks you leave the European Union and therefore you won't have the problem of free movement. If refugees is your problem as well, i.e. people from outside the UK, from outside the European Union, where we have a points-based system, we're going to be weaker, because at the moment we're in a happy position of being part of what's called the Schengen Agreement, the Dublin Accord, but outside Schengen. That means any refugee that comes into Europe has to register at the first country they come to. We have deported around 100,000 people for not meeting that. But you need a visa to come in the UK because we're outside of Schengen. If we come out of the European Union, we lose the benefit of the Dublin Accord, and incidentally, at our most vulnerable point, which is Calais to Dover, we lose the cooperation of the French, which means basically that British border force are in Calais, not in Dover. That's what stopped a lot of refugees coming here. We lose all of that. The French will say, yeah, take your border back, thank you. And I think this is absolutely crucial. Martin says in his very reasonable way, on balance, and I think we can do deals with them. In the modern world, we've only ever been part of the European Union. The last 40 years. The world's transformed in the last 40 years. It's become more interdependent. The idea of Australia, India, Pakistan are all asking us to stay in the European Union. The idea we could come out and sort of go back to some happy Commonwealth deal from the 50s isn't going to work.
No, I'm not arguing that.
Well, right, okay, well, you're too sensible to argue that, but some do, Martin. And to do a deal with the rest of Europe, 8 of our 10 biggest exporters are in Europe, and businesses who say it's regulation, it's quite the opposite. Point about being part of the biggest commercial market, bigger than China, bigger than the US, is you don't need to fill in forms every time you cross a border. You don't fill a different form in if you're exporting to Italy or France. It's a benefit. That's why business is so concerned about this. Why would you lose the benefit of that market? So here's my point. We would leave the European Union and then we'd spend time and money over many years trying to get back to the same trading position we had. It doesn't make sense. It's crazy.
And Martin, would you come back and say that maybe we should be looking to China and Asia and America, and that how successful their economies may be? Is that a kind of model that you're looking to?
Yeah, when I mentioned sort of India and China, they are the emerging economies and clearly are going to be world players over the next generation. I'm not arguing for Fortress Britain by any means. We do play our part in what is genuinely nowadays a global economy. And you say, I'm not looking for Fortress Britain, but I do believe that our focus is too much on a rather bureaucratic, undemocratic setup that was established in the 1950s and hasn't actually kept pace with the modern world.
We can change that though, Martin. We are an important player in Europe. We're not the kind of seven-stone weakling having sand kicked in our face on the beach. We're a crucial player. We've made many changes. Conservative government made many very important, subsidiarity being one of them. We can change those things. No one's saying the institution's perfect, but that market is vital. And if we want to negotiate trade deals with China or America or India or Pakistan, the strength of doing it through the European Union with 500 million consumers gives us a clout we couldn't possibly have on our own.
And other countries go it alone, don't they? You look at Norway and how successful that is. Do you think there's a possibility, Martin, that could be us?
Well, I'm not entirely convinced by the argument. I was convinced some of my colleagues put forward about Norway and Switzerland and so on. They are very different countries, tiny populations by comparison with our own, very dependent on Norway's very dependent, as we know, on the oil and offshore and fishing and so on. We've moved on, and my point is that as I say, we want to move away from what is actually a fairly inward-looking organisation and push our frontiers onto a world scale, and that's something I think we could do better with the freedoms that independence would give us, rather than the rather restrictive union.
But Norway is the 10th biggest contributor to the EU. It has no say whatsoever in its rules, but they adapt every single one of them. They're even part of Schengen. Free movement applies to Norway.
Would you want to see Britain go that way?
Of course not.
But
why would
not?
we do
why
that?
not? Why would the main reasons not?
What's one
If
simple
they've
reason?
been successful.
There's one simple reason. We would be leaving the European Union to actually be part of the European Union anyway by adopting every single regulation, but not having any say. And by paying all that money in. I mean, of course you don't want a Norwegian model. Or the Swiss model, ditto. Or Liechtenstein, ditto. Or Iceland, ditto. Any part of the free trade area that's in Europe accepts all the European Union rules, more or less, and go further than that and accept things like Schengen, which means open borders, but have absolutely no say in what goes on.
Martin, how would you respond to that?
Well, only by repeating what I've already said, in effect. Yes, of course, if you trade with the EU partners, you have to abide by their rules, as I said earlier, in the same way as to trade with America, you have to abide by American rules. So business is very capable of adapting. And borders are actually, in many ways, irrelevant as far as enterprise and entrepreneurship is concerned. They will move and adapt accordingly. So I think of course business has to be regulated, but they also need the freedoms of being able to trade with whoever and wherever and establish new markets. And I think the encouragement not being part of the union would give to many of our businesses would actually broaden the horizons and be helpful. Okay,
if we move on to the military then, not being within the European Union, would that weaken our military?
It wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference to our military. It'd weaken our security, would be my argument. That
because they are saying that EU leaders are backing for its own army.
No,
what do you think about that?
They're not.
They're not.
As simple as that. It's one of the many myths about Europe. Yeah,
there you go. We'll sack the research.
Although it weakens my argument, I have to say I agree with it. I mean, the idea that the French, for example, are going to give up their independence of their armed forces is just a nonsense. It's a nonsense that we would give it up. We simply wouldn't. No independent sovereign nation would.
A massive area then is membership savings. That's a big area. So, you know, the figures here I've got is £55 million per day that's being given to the European Union. These savings then, Martin, that's a fair point, isn't it? We'd be saving money.
Well, there would be savings. It wouldn't be £55 million a day because, of course, some of the functions carried out by the EU would then have to be transferred to the British government to take on some of the environmental regulations and other similar things. But, you know, our farming industry, agriculture would need some sort of support if it pulled out of the CAP. But there are other things that would be beneficial. I mean, in this area in particular, the reason there's a lot of hostility to membership goes back to the sellout of the fishing industry in the original negotiations. And that figures a great deal in people's minds. So again, it would balance. Even if the savings were only 10% of that, it would still be a significant amount of money that we could spend on our own needs.
Sorry, Martin, we'll come back to that to that one after the break. But please do join us in a little while. Welcome back. I'm with Helen Hezel, MP Alan Johnson, and Martin Vickers, the MP for Cleethorpes. So we're discussing the arguments for and against the UK staying in the European Union. Well, we asked these people in Grimsby today for their thoughts.
Better to be poor and free than rich and in chains.
Well, I don't think it's doing us any good. It's flooding the country out with people we don't want.
I think we'd be a lot better dealing on our own with other countries. There's so many other countries to deal with apart from Europe, and I think we could do a lot better deals with some of them countries than we're doing at the moment.
I don't know. Myself, I'm divided on it. You hear so many good things from one side and so many good things from the other side. I don't know about that one.
I don't know. I don't really know the whys and the wherefores. I'd like to know, and then I can evaluate for myself. Probably out. I'd like to think we're better out because all the money that we're pouring into it. But if that works, I don't really know because they don't give us the information for us to work that out for ourselves.
It's time we looked after ourselves. We've done for donkey's years, haven't we? And we've done all right. And we don't need somebody else from abroad telling us what we should and shouldn't do. We want a government that can look after us and a proper leader, what can lead.
I think it's debatable, like, you know, it's one or the other, isn't it? And to be honest with you don't know which one to go. It's rivers to cross, so to speak.
You've got two sides of that. One is security of being in, but I've always felt that we should be independent. But whether that would work, I don't know. But I do think that we are propping other people up while being in there, and I think we could do better on our own.
If a man runs a business, he can sell his, whether it's toilet rolls or cars, he can sell his business anywhere. If people don't want to buy it, they won't buy it, whether we're in the union or not.
Now, before we discuss a sense of feeling with those foxes, I just want to come back to the point of saving money. Alan, that is a big argument, isn't it? That people are saying that we would save an awful lot of money if we weren't in the European Union.
Well, it's true that Britain are a net contributor. We're a rich country. We can contribute more than we get back. Funnily enough, that's not the case in Yorkshire and the Humber. Yorkshire and the Humber, we're net beneficiaries of being members of the European Union. But like Martin, I think the public get bombarded with figures on this, and in a sense, it's not the central issue. We spend comparatively little compared to our national wealth. The CBI's claimed that being members of the European Union is worth £3,000 a year for every household because of the oomph that gives us in exports and in jobs, etc. And that is very difficult to quantify that, actually. So I think at the end of the day, people will make their decision on other factors, because they'll be listening to one side of the argument that says actually we get more money from the European Union, and another side of the argument that says it will save money. But in the end, it's Britain's place in the world. It's standing in the world. It's jobs.
But business
it's security.
owners in East Yorkshire and Northern Lincolnshire, they're a bit disgruntled, aren't they? I mean, you've got the Business for Britain Yorkshire that's launched. More than 60 businesses have come together, you know, to say that they're worried and concerned that it's harder for them to create jobs. What do you make?
They're outweighed by the number of companies in this area that say that being out of the European Union would be disastrous. They're far outweighed.
These are the small, medium-sized businesses, aren't they?
No, the SMEs equally, Federation of Small Businesses will tell you this. You know, I mean, yes, of course, there are some businesses who argue this way. You can find some businesses that argue that way, but overwhelmingly, whether it's the CBI, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce,
60 in Yorkshire have come together and they've got real concerns.
Out of how many? What percentage of that is the number of businesses? I'm only saying
it's 145.
I'm not saying their concerns aren't. I'm just saying that it's a minority of businesses. The vast majority of businesses think we're better off in the European
But Martin, when it comes to our region, more than 60 is quite a lot. You can't ignore these concerns that these businesses have, can you?
No, of course not. No, but I do agree with Alan that it will come down to a sort of general feeling as to what Britain's place in the world for the next generation is. And there is, all the evidence is that there is a sort of clear difference between our generation and the younger generation, and that will play a significant part because it's the older generation that tend to turn out and vote in greater numbers. So it's very difficult to predict how it will go. But it will come down to a much more sort of gut instinct, and whether you feel that Britain's place is as an independent sovereign nation within the Union, or a much more independent sovereign nation with the freedoms to look to the wider world.
So would you say you're on the side of these businesses or not?
Well, I'm on the side of business because obviously I want business to succeed and boost the local economy and provide the jobs that we all need. But I don't necessarily feel that some of the arguments that they put forward are actually have got a great deal of substance to them. I think there is a general feeling amongst the business community, as indeed, as I recall, there was in 1975, that we should be a part of what was then the common market. But at that time, the emphasis was much more on the fact that it was a common market, a trading organisation, and many people now feel that they were misled by the politicians at the time of that referendum. So I don't know. Yes, I want to do all I can to help and support the businesses, but I do feel that they're being to some extent led by the leadership of the CBI and the Institute of Directors and these sort of people. And when you look at individual businesses, you know, out at Immingham or somewhere like that, the actual difference he'll make on the ground is probably not a great deal.
Well, I suppose when you look at businesses like Siemens or the investment that happened there, Siemens say that if they, you know, if we weren't part of the European Union, that they fear that other companies won't invest. You think about the renewables sector, the investment, the boom that's had to our region. Is it true that if we're out of the European Union, other businesses may not want to come to our region?
Well, I don't think any of us can say, is it true that they may not want to? I think, you know, in a sense, we're looking at an unknown world. I say that is a huge risk. I say absolutely with confidence, Siemens wouldn't have come here if we were outside the European Union. I've been there, I was all the way through this 6 years. They looked at 102 different locations in Northern Europe. In the end, they chose Hull. There was strong competition from Bremerhaven and Esbjerg. They're a German company. Their wind division is based in Denmark. Of course they would have gone there if by coming to the UK they'd have been outside the European Union, therefore outside of the single market, outside of all the benefits that gives, and the political pressure on them as a German company with a Danish wind division. The political pressure was already quite intense, would have meant they'd have never come to Hull. Now, we can never prove that, but I'm absolutely confident of that. And I think, you know, given the amount of inward investment we get from Airbus, from Siemens, from Nissan, from Toyota, from all these companies, the Japanese car manufacturers in particular, who set up in Britain because of the access to the European Union, they're going to have to pay tariffs anywhere between 3 and 10% to export their cars to Europe. That's a disaster for British industry and a disaster for our economy.
Martin, what would you respond to with that?
Well, we're beginning to become a bit repetitive here, aren't we? I mean, as I say, it's a balanced argument, but when it comes down to it, businesses go where there is money to be made, and where their markets are. They're not going to be hemmed in by some artificial barriers that are created by governments and trading groups. What we want is we don't want to have a world of protectionism. That's always been bad for the British economy. And in one sense, the EU is a protective organisation. I want free trade with the whole of the trading world.
Okay, coming on to the fishing industry then, that's a massive part of heritage for Grimsby, for Hull, for both sides of the Humber. In the press, you've stated that the European Union has had a massive effect on that demise.
Yes, I mean, it's had a significant, it wasn't the only reason, because the Cod Wars played a major part as well, and we threw the towel in on that one. So, and subsequently the industry didn't help itself by selling its quotas to Spaniards and so on. But the reality is it's still a vital part of the local economy. Fortunately, in the Grimsby area, we moved on and we attracted the food processing companies, Bird's Eye, Findus and so on, established major businesses here. And so we managed to sort of get over the worst of it. But it's still important to us. The fish market and Grimsby Dock still plays a vital part, and that spreads out into the fish processing businesses. So I would like to think that the common fisheries policy is at least playing some part in the renegotiations. I've raised that with ministers. I'm not totally convinced that it is playing any significant part, but people like me have obviously got to keep banging at the door.
Because, Alan, Greenland came out of the European Union, didn't it, to do with the fishing quotas, and they've thrived, haven't they?
So Greenland did come out of the European Union, part of Canada, I think, Greenland. But look, the point is, three issues on this. Number one, what finished distant water fishing in Hull was the Cod Wars. We went into the European Union in January, February '74. Fishing was already finished in a sense because government had, as Martin said, thrown in the towel and agreed the 200-mile fishing limit around Iceland.
Okay, then we'll have to leave it there. We'll come back after this short break. Welcome back to the final part then of this week's Hot Topic. Alan Johnson, I'm going to come to you. You have a massive role in Labour's pro-EU campaign, don't you? That is a big responsibility. Are you happy to take on that responsibility? Well,
I wouldn't have taken it on if I wasn't. Yeah, no, I feel, and Martin probably agrees with this, that this is the biggest political decision we're going to make. Actually, it's bigger than even general elections and local government elections. And I was around, as was Martin, in '75, and it was a big decision then. But I say, then it was virtually the decision as to whether to go in. We'd been in for 17 months, but there were only 9 member states. Now, 40 years later, with 28 member states, with us entrenched in many ways in this very important, huge market, to wrench ourselves away. I say only this, it's a huge decision for the British people to make. And I think, just like Martin, I'm not an extremist on this. I don't think night and day about the European Union. No one loves an institution, and there isn't an institution that doesn't need to be reformed and improved. But I just think it's very important for our place in the world and our party as an internationalist party of solidarity to stay in there and influence Europe and not to walk away, and I would say be isolated on our continent and isolated in the world. So I was very happy to take this on. It is quite, I think it's going to get exciting. Your viewers might not think it's that exciting at the moment. Just been through not long ago a general election, but I think as we get to polling day, which looks like being June, it is going to be an important decision, and every vote will count in this. Unlike a general election, there's no safe seats, if you like. Everybody's vote will count. So I think I wanted to be a part of it, and there's no better way to be a part of it than leading the Labour Party's campaign.
And Martin, you have held your own in at ballot, haven't you? What?
Well, yes, I distributed some leaflets around a large part of my constituency, and as I expected, I got a very large vote in favour of leaving. But the nature of those sort of polls is the fact that it's the people who are against who tend to put their cross and send it back. But nevertheless, I do think it emphasised, as I've always said, I do think that on balance I'm representing the majority of my constituents by expressing a sort of Eurosceptic, taking a Eurosceptic line. I don't know how it will go. It will be, as Alan says, a very big decision for the country because it does set our course for the next generation. I think both governments have been at fault in as much as we should have had one or two referendums after the very big treaties that have changed the course of the Union over the last 30, 40 years. And had that been the case, I don't think there would have been the antagonism towards the EU that clearly is within the electorate. If I'm honest, I think we'd probably still be in the same position, but we would be in that position with the wholehearted support of the electorate, and it would therefore have been an easier issue, certainly for my party to handle. And let's face it, the Labour Party have been on both sides of the argument as well over the years. So it's an important decision. I think the British people, on the whole, they're very discerning. They sit back, they listen to these party political knockabouts and so on, but actually, when it comes down to it, they know there is an instinctive feeling for the direction of the country and what's best, and I think they'll think carefully about it. And in those last few days, like in general elections, it's the last few days that are often critical because people don't take notice of all the knockabout for weeks on end, but they know it's a serious decision for them and their families and their communities. So it is a vitally important decision, there's no doubt about it, and it's going to be very interesting.
And some people say, like the Dinners Voxes there, that they're not actually sure because they don't feel that the facts have been stated to them. Alan, is that something that you think is an issue? Do you think enough is out there to make people see the positives of staying in?
I would say very gently to those people, and I bump into them up and down the Hazel Road in my constituency. Actually, there's lots of facts out there. Whether they want to turn on programmes, Panorama or World in Action, all about European Union, or this week, even at 11:40 on a Thursday night, and listeners waffling on about it, they probably don't. They don't mean to say the information's not there. I think, in the end, those people might be complaining they've got too much information because there'll be lots of, just in 75, there are two umbrella campaigns set up, funded by and regulated by the Electoral Reform Society. They get some taxpayers' money to do party political broadcasts and to send out leaflets. So they'll get lots of that. And so, I'm sure it will be an informed decision. But I think it's probably unfair and inaccurate to say that they just haven't had any information. Martin's side of the argument are trying to give them information all the time, so are our side of the argument. Whether they want to read it or look at it is a matter for them.
Martin, what do you think about David Cameron saying that politicians are free to campaign how they choose on this issue?
It was always going to be so, wasn't it? As in 1975 when Harold Wilson gave his cabinet free rein, there are clearly a number of members of the cabinet who have always been on the Eurosceptic side. It's a sensible thing to do. If anything, I would argue it's a sign of strength rather than weakness, but I think the vast majority of the people sort of shrug their shoulders and say, well, fair enough, and they have their favourite politicians, the ones who they believe and the ones who they disbelieve, and we'll see how it goes.
And how is it in the Labour camp then, Alan? Is everyone backing this?
Remarkably united, yeah. I say so because Martin's right, in 75 we were very divided. Then the opposition, which was Conservative opposition, were very supportive. Margaret Thatcher was going around with her EU jumper, you remember. We're very united on it. This time it's the other way round. I mean, we are united on this. We had a very good conference decision on it. Jeremy Corbyn, as soon as he was elected, signed up to this, asked me to continue with the campaign. It is the Labour Party. It's not a fringe of the Labour Party or a subsection. It is the Labour Party saying we believe that we're better off in the European Union and we should remain. So whereas I'd accept an argument that we're divided on all kinds of issues, I wouldn't accept that we're divided on this.
And looking ahead then, Martin, what do you see in the future?
Well, David Cameron will return and he'll say it's been a great triumph, this renegotiation, just as Harold Wilson did 40 years ago. But as I say, the people will, they're very discerning.
Do you think we'll be out of the European Union?
If I'm absolutely honest, I think we'll probably vote to stay in. I was on the losing side 40 years ago, so but at least I can argue I've been consistent. But I think the important thing is a decision will have been made, and it will have been made by the people as a whole, and not an individual government. And therefore, I think that it will be much more widely accepted. There will be people who will still argue the case. There always will be. But no, I think I think the referendum, though it might be quite divisive at times, will actually be beneficial for the country, because we'll set our course. We can't go on arguing about this for the next 40 years. We've got to set our direction of travel and stick to it for the good of the country. I think it's important. It's an important decision. We'll make it, and then whatever happens, we must accept it and move on.
And do you agree, Alan, that now is the time that it has to be sorted?
Well, now we have a referendum, and we had a government a party that was committed to a referendum, and they were elected. So yes, in that sense, yes, and I agree with practically every word Martin just said. It is. It's nowhere in the back. This is going to be very close. No one can be confident either way on this, and no one can be complacent on either side. And it will go right to the wire, I suspect. In the end, I hope that it's a vote to stay in. I kind of think if that's the case, then people know what it's like in the European Union. We've been in it for 40 years. I think if it's an out, then I don't think we can just move on, because then we have to reach a trade agreement with every single one of the countries we were just trading in Europe, 8 of our 10 biggest trading partners. We have to reach a trade agreement with all the countries where our trade agreement is currently through the EU. I mean, there is a difficult situation to face if it's a leave vote. I think if it's a remain vote, it does settle the issue, and that's it.
And do you think the fact that David Cameron's saying that if these changes are, adhered to, and that does go ahead, that he will campaign to stay in the European Union, that must give...
No Prime Minister will want to be the Prime Minister that took Britain out of the European Union. And incidentally, if Britain come out of the European Union, I think Scotland will come out of Britain. I think that will give them the reason for their second referendum. If they voted heavily to stay in, and they'll say, look, Scotland voted to stay in. So I think you run the risk of Great Britain falling apart. Prime Minister doesn't want that. But the important thing is the Prime Minister's, wherever the Prime Minister comes down, matters to people. The polling shows that it makes a big difference for Conservative voters. Actually, it makes a difference for Labour voters, because he is the Prime Minister of this country.
On that note, Alan, I don't have to leave it there. So Martin Vickers, Alan Johnson, thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. And that's it then for tonight's Hot Topic. Join in the chat on Twitter using the hashtag Hot Topic. Email your views to hottopic@sd.tv. But until next time, goodbye.